Number 6, the birth of England. And because this is such a vast subject, I did think at first of breaking it into 2 parts, the birth of England 1, the birth of England 2. We may decide to do that still, but bearing in mind that I want to talk about barbarian law codes and all sorts of other things, I also want to talk about the end of the barbarian period. Bearing in mind all of those things, I will try to keep England as one single set of slides. Oh, and the cover image is King Edgar, flanked by the Virgin Mary and St. Peter. It's from Winchester in 966. It commemorates the building of Winchester. Here is a map of Roman Britain. Look at the caution up here. Authorities disagree on exact routes and stations. So these are the main roads in Roman Britain. This was produced about 20 years ago, and it's based on work which has been continuing now for several hundred years. And it's still necessary to give a caution to say that we don't actually know where many of these roads went. The black roads, those are pretty well attested. You can dig them up, or in many cases, other roads have been built on top of them. So the road that runs down to Richborough and Dover, that is the A20. I think that's the A20 nowadays. Or Watling Street, and we know where it went. But many of the red roads, no, we have a vague idea that these were roads, and that's it. And this is in summary what we know about Roman Britain, which is not very much. We have almost no literary sources which describe what went on in Britain. Oh, we have bits of Tacitus which talk about the conquest of the north of England and Scotland, or the Boudica Rebellion, and you have bits in the lives of the third century emperors which may refer occasionally to Britain. But Britain is a very unattested part of the Roman Empire. You press the sources asking, well, yes, anything about Britain. And one of the most exciting things in the later history is in 358, 3 British bishops attend the Council of Rimini. It is like that. We don't know that much about Roman Britain. We don't know that much because not many literary sources have survived, indeed not many were probably produced. We also don't know that much because after the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, most of the built environment of Roman Britain was either destroyed or was suffered to fall into ruin. And then, of course, where cities like London and York are concerned, these were large but of unknown size in antiquity, but because they have been continuously occupied and redeveloped and expanded since the early Middle Ages, it's often not easy to work out what was going on under the ground. We've learned a great deal more about Roman London since the Second World War. The bombing was the excuse for wholesale redevelopment of large parts of central London. The redevelopment may not have been aesthetically pleasing, but it did allow people to dig down much further than would otherwise have been the case, and to dig down over wider areas. And so since the 1940s, we have realised that London was a much larger and a much more important city than was once realised. Until the Second World War, the general view of Roman Britain was that it was an extremely marginal province right on the edge of ancient civilization. The Romans had taken it over simply to prevent anybody from using the coast of Kent and Sussex and Essex as a base from which to raid the more Romanised areas of Gaul. Since the Second World War, we have moved to a rather better view of Roman Britain, which shows it as not an enormously wealthy province. It was never the equivalent of Gaul. Certainly it was no Africa or Italy. But it was a quietly prosperous place for most of the Roman period. It was prosperous, it was contented, it was mostly peaceful. Every so often there would be a break through the northern border, or there'd be landings on the coast, and then you'd have barbarians marching about, raping, burning, killing, doing all the usual barbarian-y sorts of thing. But for the most part that didn't happen, and it seems that Britain was a peaceful, contented, rather prosperous province, though the weather was always against it. Now, what happens with Britain? And the answer is not very much. Remember the Great Crisis after 406? No, let's remember the Great Crisis that began in 395. The empire is divided in half, and East and West must now pay for their own defence from their own resources. The West falls into an immediate difficulty. It needs to maintain large active armies along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. It doesn't have the resources to do so. In around 400, the armies were withdrawn from Britain. They were withdrawn from Britain not because Britain was regarded as undefendable, because the situation was so hopeless that there was no point fighting for it. The armies were withdrawn from Britain because Britain was not seen as particularly endangered. The armies were needed to shore up the defence of the Rhine. When you have barbarian armies pouring across the Rhine and fanning out through France into Spain, and Britain is just drifting on much the same as it has for the past 150 years, there is an obvious temptation to say, well, we've got 30,000 men in Britain, we'll get them out and put them here. So the armies were withdrawn and never brought back. In 410, the British cities, the councils, the town councils of the cities in Britain wrote to the Emperor Honorius saying, well, when are we going to have the armies back? We don't feel very safe. And the Emperor wrote back saying, I'm sorry, but I just don't have the resources to return the armies to Britain, so sorry. You'll have to look after yourselves. You're on your own. That is the end of Roman Britain. What happens next? And we have an enormous problem of sources. What goes on in England? Let's talk about England now. Let's talk about those parts of Roman Britain which are now broadly covered by England. What happens in England between about 400 and 550? And the answer is we don't know. We don't know much about Africa, but we know a great deal more about Africa than we do about Britain. We've got a number of sources. We have a British monk, a Welsh monk he'd be called nowadays, Gildas. He was writing around 530 AD on the ruin of Britain. This appears to be a history. It's just that when you look closely at what he says, it's very difficult to give dates and places to anything. He talks at great length about the vices of the British and how these vices allowed the country to be overrun by Saxon barbarians, and that this was all very bad. It's just that if you try to use what he says to construct a narrative with dates and events and places, you'll end up scratching your head, or more likely, you'll end up shouting at anyone else who is trying to do the same, because you'll find that you cannot possibly agree. Gildas is essential, but probably useless. You have someone called Nennius. Historia Brittonum, 9th century. And this is something that you would normally dismiss out of hand because it's produced 400 years after the event, and it's filled with claims that are often nonsensical, but it seems to contain a certain amount of true information. But as with any document that contains true and false information, you will not find any agreement on what is the true information and what is the false. You then have Bede, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a first-rate work, the greatest historical work produced in the Middle Ages, indeed perhaps the only work in the West, the only work in Latin that really deserves the title of history. But it is a very carefully written work, and it has an agenda. It has an agenda which requires the quiet suppression of a great deal of very important information. I'll come on to that. You then have scattered references in Greek, Latin, Welsh writings. For example, Procopius, the historian of the reign of Justinian, mentions Britain now and again, but he mentions Britain so now and again and so ambiguously that perhaps it might have been best if he had forgotten the place existed. And so there is a shortage of literary sources. The archaeology is not always terribly informative, and in the absence of actual evidence, well, we're left with the things like that picture there. Charles Ernest Butler, King Arthur. No evidence that Arthur existed, but it's a fine set of stories, and it fills in a gap in the history. I won't say much about Gildas. I've mentioned him. He is not an unreliable historian. He just isn't an historian. If you were to bring him back and say you didn't do a very good job of telling us a history of Britain after the end of direct Roman rule, his answer would be, well, I wasn't trying to do that. Sorry, don't blame me. I was trying to point out the vices of the people in Britain, and I think I did a very good job of that. Bede, however, he's the important person. Let's have a look down here. 2/3 down in this blue box, this is from chapter 22 of Bede's Great History. To other crimes beyond description, which their own historian Gildas mournfully relates, they added this, that they never preached the faith to the Saxons or English who dwelt amongst them. Nevertheless, the goodness of God did not forsake his people, whom he foreknew, but sent to the aforesaid nation much more worthy heralds of the truth to bring it to the faith. This, I think, sums up the agenda of Bede. Bede is a great historian, a very good writer, and he is worth reading. But the underlying message, or perhaps the explicit message of his history, is that the English are, in a most peculiar sense, God's chosen people. They were led by God to invade the island of Britain and to displace the Aboriginal inhabitants. The Aboriginal inhabitants had become corrupt and no longer worthy of possessing the island. So the English were brought here by God, and they were evangelized directly from Rome. The British, who were Christians, they made no effort to convert the Saxons or to convert the English. And so England is a new beginning. That is what Bede says. In order to keep on message, it is necessary for Bede not to fabricate, he would never do that, but it is useful for Bede either to suppress something very quietly or to give it a very passing mention so that you might not notice it unless you're looking for it. Here is Bede. I won't read to you from that blue box. I'll send you the PowerPoint slides as usual, and you can look at those yourself. But Bede describes the Anglo-Saxon settlement as in 3 phases. The first is the exploration phase. This is when mercenaries, Saxon mercenaries, are brought in to protect the Romanised British. Remember, 410, Honorius writes back to the British, I do not have the resources to send armies into Britain at the moment. Please look to your own defence. What the British might have done was to say, we will raise an army of our own people and we will build a fleet as well. But they didn't do that. No, they hired barbarian mercenaries from across the North Sea. The barbarian mercenaries came in, looked around and thought, a promising place. You then have the migration phase, which may have been substantial. I'll come to that. Then you have the establishment phase, in which the Anglo-Saxons, we'll call them that, started to control areas. It seems, as I said, that the Romanised Britons in the cities decided to hire barbarian mercenaries to protect the coast and the northern borders of Britain from attack by anybody else. The barbarian mercenaries came over, looked around, thought, this is a nice place. They then brought their families, established large communities, and then took over. And the British did nothing about this until it was too late, and by the time it was too late, it was indeed too late. Various reasons why the barbarians came here. One reason is that there may have been rising sea levels in northwestern Europe at this point, which were beginning not to inundate, it was not very dramatic, but there was a great deal of coastal erosion in northern Europe, which meant that the populations needed to be decanted somewhere else. Or it may simply be that because Britain was no longer defended, it was now wide open to being colonised. What happens after 400 is that the Saxon shore has been denuded of its usual defenders. They've been taken into Gaul to defend the Rhine frontier. Mercenaries are brought in to take the place of the Roman armies. There is some evidence, it's ambiguous evidence, but there is some evidence of a re-emergent Celtic identity in 5th century Britain. It seems that the King of Cornwall and Devon called himself Rex Dum Nuniorum, but this is ambiguous. What we can say is that the unified Roman administration of Britain very rapidly broke down and was replaced by an overlapping patchwork of native kingdoms. This being said, although Roman life was beginning to disintegrate, not to be destroyed, but to disintegrate, there is evidence of building works in Cirencester, Wroxeter, Carlisle. There's also evidence, not proof, there's evidence for new water pipes and baths at St Albans. So it's not the case that Roman civilization immediately collapsed in this country, but it fell to pieces. And how long it took to fall to pieces and where it last fell to pieces is something that we cannot say with any degree of confidence. This is where I suppose we came from, because this, in a sense, is us. Indeed, in many cases, this is us. The barbarians, the Angles, the Jutes and the Saxons, they came from those areas of northern Europe. This map shows that they mostly came from, Schleswig-Holstein, North Germany, Denmark, but it was there were some came from Holland, and some came from other bits of northern Germany, and some came from Scandinavia. It was a general movement, but predominantly Angles, Saxons and Jutes. They settled the western and the southern parts of the country, pushing the native Britons, And I suppose one should say that the native Britons were, in a sense, the people who, at some point in the Bronze Age, had displaced the original inhabitants, but let's not get into that. The barbarian invaders displaced the pre-existing populations, pushing them further and further west until they had Wales and Cornwall to themselves. Oh, and bits of what are now northern England, Cumberland, and so on. This brings us to the matter of genetics. What happened? Is it the case that the Angles and Saxons came to this country and they began a very successful process of ethnic cleansing and genocide, which wiped large areas of England clean of pre-existing populations so that they could then settle? Is that what happened? Or did the barbarians come in as dominant minorities and they imposed their language and their ways on the natives? Or is there somewhere in between? The genetic evidence, and this is from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, the genetic evidence is that the traditional population of modern England is about 25 to 40% Anglo-Saxon. I'm not sure what that means, because we are looking back 1500 years, and it depends on how vigorously different sections of the population have been breeding in that time. But the evidence appears to be that there was a very substantial immigration from northwestern Europe into this country, and that this still has a genetic footprint. At the same time, a great deal of modern English ancestry has continuity with the pre-barbarian past, or with the pre-Anglo-Saxon past. What I suspect happened was that there was some ethnic cleansing, there was some mass murder, there was a lot of intermarriage, or let's not talk about intermarriage, there was a lot of interbreeding, because quite often the Anglo-Saxons would have forced their attentions on young Celtic women. So let's not dignify it with the term intermarriage. Let's just talk in a more neutral and perhaps a blunter sense of interbreeding. So there was a bit of mass murder, a bit of ethnic cleansing, a bit of interbreeding, and I suspect that there was also a lot of differential mortality from the plague of Justinian. Remember, this burst into the Mediterranean world in 542. We know that it spread as far as this country, and bearing in mind, I'm assuming here, but bearing in mind that the native British would probably have had deeper and more continuous contacts with the continent than the Anglo-Saxons, the plague would have had a bigger effect in the Celtic areas. It is possible that, not in any sense whitewashing the Anglo-Saxons, it is possible that in some cases the native English would suddenly notice that nobody was making a fuss as they moved further inland, and they found just piles of rotting bodies when they went in to have a look around. Whatever the case, within about 150 years, the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, brought over to defend the country from other barbarians, found themselves in undisputed possession of most of the country. The language. In 400, as far as we can tell, the majority spoke Celtic. Latin was the language of the elite, and it was probably widely understood through most of the Roman province of Britain. When the barbarians invaded the European provinces of the Western Empire, indeed when they invaded Africa, they very quickly dropped their own languages in favour of Latin, And by now the church was making a big push in the countryside, so that by about 600, maybe 700 at the latest, the overwhelming majority of people in those parts of Western Europe spoke Latin. They spoke Vulgar Latin, the spoken language, which is not at all the same as the classical language. Whereas in Britain, by 700, the dominant language in eastern and southern England was English. Anglo-Saxon is an amalgamation. It's an amalgamation of various West Germanic dialects, and it was gradually, though I think I should say rapidly, softened and homogenized into a separate language. Now, Anglo-Saxon shows very little influence, effectively no influence, from Celtic or spoken Latin, and most place names in England are English. London is one of the exceptions. It's been called London possibly as far back as the Stone Age. This is a unique experience. As I said, when the Franks took over France, they very rapidly abandoned their Germanic languages and adopted spoken Latin. And there are very few Germanic words in modern French. Many words that have been borrowed from German, but very few words in French which can be traced back to that mixing of peoples after about the year 400. Whereas in England, Latin and Celtic were wiped from the map. They hold on in Wales and Cornwall. This led to another unique situation. In France, in Spain, in Africa, certainly in Italy, the prestige language, the language of the educated elite, was Latin. And it could be that because the language of everybody else was a kind of Latin, a kind of late Latin, early Romance, proto-Romance perhaps. So when you wrote, you would write in Latin, a cleaned up version of the language that you spoke. Whereas in England, yes, Latin was used by the church, and it was used for diplomacy, it was used for all sorts of purposes. But when people became literate, they found it convenient to use their own language for writing wills and charters and laws and all sorts of other things. If you want to know what French or Spanish or Italian were doing around the year 900, there is no way of looking directly because there are no written materials. If you want to know anything about the evolution of these languages, it's guesswork, because the first attested writings, the first attested use of French, Italian, Spanish, etc., is around the year 1100. Maybe a bit before, maybe a bit later, but that's when these languages first come onto the record. Whereas English has been on the record since about 600 and maybe since about 400. Here is, on the right in the blue boxes, here is the Lord's Prayer in English. This is not in the English that would have been spoken around the year 600. This translation was made in around 995. But that is the language spoken by the Anglo-Saxons. And here underneath you have an alleged poem that Bede wrote in English on his deathbed, and he died in 735. Do you recognise any of those words as English? A very interesting discussion, sadly deleted, among the students of the origins and the quality of the English language. It is wonderful to look back so far into the past and say, yes, that's my language. I can understand that. A further discussion of how English developed. It's not a language I ever studied. I have a copy of the Lindisfarne Gospels upstairs where somebody has produced an English translation of the Latin, and because I can read the Latin, I can make sense of the English, but something we have to try to set aside, or perhaps we shouldn't. Perhaps we should just be aware of it. I said in a rather dismissive manner that Bede has an agenda of regarding the English as a chosen people. And of course, it is something. Bede has been completely successful, or perhaps we all agree with him anyway. And I suppose we should try to regard this as history. But you see, so far we've been looking at the barbarians as failed experiments. Yes, the Ostrogoths, they did some very good things in Italy. Oh, but they lost. And the Vandals, well, they may not have been quite as awful as their name suggests. Oh, but they lost as well. But now we're looking at the Anglo-Saxons, and I suppose you could say that they managed to clean up, didn't they? That they scooped the pool. They won the lot. A further discussion among the students who regret the Norman conquest and its effects on the English language. We are the Anglo-Saxons, and I'm afraid we're also the Norman conquest. There's no way back from it. It is something that happened. It's something that happened to us, and it's also something that we did. The Anglo-Saxon identity, and again, you have to be careful not to project your own identity into the past, onto your ancestors. We can look at the Vandals and the Ostrogoths with a degree of sympathetic objectivity, but we're looking at our own people here. But it does seem that within a very short time, the Anglo-Saxons who arrived in this country stopped thinking of themselves as, well, I'm from a place with some unpronounceable name that sounds like a dog barking, and I'm just happen to be resident outside York. They lost any sense of being settlers. Oh, they didn't forget that they were descended from settlers, but they stopped thinking of themselves as being members of an overseas tribe. New tribal identities emerged very quickly. The Cantware, named after the Roman city of Canterbury. Lindsay, these are the peoples, Humbrenses, Mercians. These are not people who gave their names to places in England. These are people who took their name from places in England that they had previously named. What I'm saying is that the various tribal groupings in England took their names from the locations that they controlled. And it's possible to say that an English identity, or a group of English identities, had emerged as early as 700. And also, when you look at the royal genealogies, although the Queen, if she was so inclined, could trace her ancestry back to various people in the German forests around 200, the only certain genealogies that she has go back to the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons in this country in the 5th century. So, as far as Bede is concerned, the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons wiped the previous history of the country clean, or it pressed a reset button on the land of Britain. But it seems to have pressed a reset button in the minds of the arrivals. They stopped thinking of themselves as Jutes, Anglo-Saxons, etc. They rapidly, or they at some point before very long, began to think of themselves maybe not as English, but as something proto-English. This is a story that I'll pass over. It's the story of Immer, which is unlikely. It's a young man who's taken prisoner. He tries to pass himself off as a peasant, but he's recognised by his general bearing that he's from an altogether higher class. So he isn't killed. Instead, he's sold into slavery. He's taken off to London to be sold, but there is a miracle. The chains put on him keep dropping off. So eventually he's allowed to go into Kent, and to raise money from his relations as a ransom. But one of the important things about this story is that you have the beginnings of class stratification, and with this comes the ability within the kingdoms. There was still a great deal of fighting between the various kingdoms, but the ability within the kingdoms to protect life and property in some respects. And that allows the re-emergence of trade and other exchanges. But let me turn to the coming of Christianity, which is something we covered a few weeks ago. This is St. Augustine of Canterbury. He is preaching before King Ethelbert and his wife Bertha. And I won't call it a work of propaganda, because I have no reason to suppose that there was anything positively untrue in Bede's account. However, if you read the relevant chapters in Bede's history, you will come away with the impression that before Augustine turned up directly from Pope Gregory the Great in 597, the whole of England was a howling desert of paganism. The English people had taken England, but they were still ignorant of the true faith of Christ. Therefore, from the great goodness of his heart, or directed by God himself, Gregory chose Augustine to come and show the light to the English people. But it does seem that there were substantial Christian communities all over England before the 590s. Queen Bertha of Kent, she was from the royal family of France, and she was allowed to bring not just a priest with her on marrying King Ethelbert, she was allowed to bring a bishop, and bishops don't usually go anywhere unless they have a church to head. It is possible to say that the bishop was brought over to Kent to minister to pre-existing Christian communities in Kent. Not on the Welsh borders, but here, well, I'm in Kent, but here, where I am, in Kent. There's also a casual reference in Bede that after Augustine had arrived, he summoned a council of British bishops. Not bishops that he had created, but he summoned a council of bishops. It doesn't say where or when he did this, but it does look as though Augustine did have a commission directly from the Pope, and so he was the most senior Christian in the country, but he was by no means the only Christian in the country, and he was not the head of the only Christian church in this country. Bede is required by his agenda to emphasise that the English wiped the country clean of its pre-existing inhabitants, and at the same time that Christianity had been erased from the country, and so the English were converted by a special dispensation of God and by the motion of the Pope himself, not from casual missionaries coming across from you tell me where, but by an actual order from the Pope. And here is a representation of Gregory the Great giving St. Augustine his instructions to convert the people of England. And all through the Middle Ages, there was a close and friendly relationship between the English people and the Papacy. We regarded each other with particular affection. A list of bullet points here. 688, King Cadwalla of Wessex visits Rome to be baptized by the Pope. Unusual. 704, Ethelred, King of Mercia, retires to a monastery. 709, Ceolred retires to a monastery in Rome. You have the use of England as a breeding ground for missionaries to be sent off to convert Germany. So there was a special relationship between England and Rome, and this of course required a great deal of rewriting of history after about 1530. You had the sudden rediscovery of indigenous pre-Augustinian Christianity in this country that Bede tries to overlook. Here is the grave of St. Augustine in Canterbury. It was, for nearly 1,000 years, a magnificent structure in Canterbury. Then in the 1530s it was demolished, and this is the best we can do to commemorate it nowadays. But until the Reformation in this country, English Christianity was seen as something that had been communicated directly from Rome. Since then, of course, it's been seen as something pre-existing that was given some assistance from Rome, but as soon as Rome turned corrupt at some point in the Middle Ages, English Christianity simply resumed its sovereign independence. But that is, of course, another matter. I keep on saying we call them barbarians, but they were not savages. This is what the English barbarians were capable of producing within 100 years of their conversion to Christianity. These are the Lindisfarne Gospels, which were produced in, I believe, 698 to mark the exhumation of Cuthbert, who I think was in Jarrow, I can't remember, somewhere in the north of England, and his formal proclamation as a saint. I don't know what happened to St. Cuthbert's shrine, but I am aware that his body was said to have been incorrupt, and that every so often it was necessary to cut the hair. But I should imagine at the time of the Reformation, it was all taken out and burned. A sudden digression into archaeology, which turns eventually to a discussion of toilets. What we've learned by looking at ancient toilets is, although we think of people in the ancient world as being very clean and particular in their personal habits, they were just as dirty as people in the Middle Ages, and perhaps dirtier than people in the early modern period, when many people just didn't bother even washing. Because if you go swimming nowadays, you're getting into water which is pumped full of hydrogen peroxide and God knows what, and which is filtered and kept moving, and you still pick up verrucas and the occasional skin infection. Whereas in the ancient world, you're going into these magnificent bathhouses, which are possibly as big and as magnificent as St. Paul's Cathedral, but you're then stepping into pools of what, in the bacterial sense, is a sewer. Quite often the water was only changed when it turned visibly brown. You come out of these baths and you say, I'm feeling so clean now. And yes, you've washed all the dirt off you, you're not smelly, but as I said, you might as well have been splashing around in a sewer for what you've picked up. You could look at the surface of a bath pool and it was covered in a film of grease from all the cosmetics that had come off people's faces. Ancient baths probably best avoided, but by looking at ancient combs dug up in modern Israel, by looking at latrine deposits, it's possible to say that people in the ancient world suffered just as much from lice and ticks and intestinal worms as people until the end of the 19th century, I suppose. Bathing in England was still quite common until the 1520s. There was a gigantic sweating sickness, a plague, in the 1520s, which seems to have killed 1/3 of the population, but because these things happen on a regular basis, it's dropped out of the history. It's not the same as the Black Death or the Great Plague of the 1660s. But one of the measures to control the spread of the sweating sickness was the closure of all the public bathhouses, after when people became much, much less washed than they had been beforehand. Elizabeth I, for example, what was it? She's said to have taken 3 baths a year, whether or not she needed them. She was probably no dirtier than people in the ancient world, if you'd taken a bacteriological view of her skin. Anyway, here is London in Roman times, as far as we can reconstruct it. Not the equivalent of Rome, nor Carthage, nor of many European cities, but a substantial walled settlement with a population of maybe 30, maybe 60,000. And this is London in the Anglo-Saxon period. And this apparently is Charing Cross and Villiers Street, and further up you have the Strand and then Covent Garden. This is London as it was until about 1200 years ago. One of the interesting things about Anglo-Saxon London is that it's not London, it's Westminster. The walled city was, so far as we can tell, and this is all conjectural, the walled Roman city of London was largely uninhabited before about 700. Instead, the Anglo-Saxon settlement was in the Covent Garden, Charing Cross area. The main church for London was St Martin in the Fields. St Paul's may have been an unroofed ruin. We don't know what was going on inside the walled city of London. There may have been a small continuing Roman population until, well, we don't actually know. Bede names London Londonwick, and he describes it about 730 as a trading centre for many nations who visit it by land and sea. But a trading centre for many nations, why, that could be a settlement of 500, 700 people. It doesn't need to be a great city. We know so little about London after about 400 and then before about 700. So there is that 300-year period of darkness, and we believe, without necessarily having very good evidence for the belief, but we believe that London was uninhabited for perhaps a century. But in 978, London does become the political capital of England, and it has been uphill all the way. I've spoken about the achievements of Christian England. Here, I don't know as much as I ought to, whereas Marilyn knows a great deal more than I do. Here is the Sutton treasure. This is what the pagan English were capable of producing around the middle of the 7th century. There is a reconstruction of the ship burial. The king in his boat, in his chamber, surrounded by his precious things. The boat is being covered over. And these are the things dug up. That wonderful helmet, the buckles, the clasps. One of my students who worked in the British Museum on the Sutton treasures tells me that this helmet is not actually Anglo-Saxon, but is from Scandinavia and may have been 150 years old when it was buried. To talk about the beginnings of England, why, you can't do that. You can't do that in a single session with a few PowerPoint slides. It is a gigantic story, and it is a story which has an obvious and a direct importance to all of us here, because we are talking about the origins of our own country, and so we approach its past with a particular, or with several particular frames of reference. We are not looking at a single completed and sadly a failed event, such as the Ostrogothic settlement of Italy or the Vandal settlement of Africa, or later on we'll be looking at the Visigothic settlement of Spain. We're not looking at something that happened and then stopped happening. We're looking at something that happened and from which grew something of enormous importance to ourselves and to the rest of the world. But what we can say is that although if you had visited England at various times in the past, let's imagine that you are visiting England at various times in the past for a quick look round. You visit Britain, the province of Britain, around 400, and you see a settled Roman society. Not large cities, but reasonable cities with a reasonable magnificence and a reasonable wealth. And you see a large and a wealthy governing class which has the confidence and the money to build villas in the countryside, in Essex, in Sussex, in Kent, etc. You come back, let's say 150 years later, in 550, and those cities have now been emptied out. The buildings have fallen down. If there are still settlements, there are people living in broken ruins with thatched makeshift roofs. And most of the land which had been ploughed and used productively is now covered again with forest. But it doesn't stay that way. If you were to come back in about 800 and certainly in 900, what you might see is, yes, London is a great deal less impressive as the political capital of England than it had been as one of the main commercial and administrative centres of Roman Britain. It does not have the same magnificence in its ceremonial heart. It may actually be richer. It may have a larger population. If you go around the countryside, you probably see the majority of people enjoying a somewhat higher standard of living than had been the case in later Roman times. Although what we regard as the conveniences of civilized life, things like running water, toilets with proper drains and so on, although these things are absent from Anglo-Saxon England, you are not in a land inhabited by savages. These are people with these are people with laws, with a literature, with a written literature, no less, with very good standards of education, and with a degree of wealth that is not entirely contemptible for its time. The barbarian invasions in England are a success. Now, don't ask me to define success. I think I'm defining success as they're a success because England has emerged from it. But, let's face it, it's hardly a contemptible outcome, is it? Nothing wrong with England. We mustn't forget the later Viking invasions, which at the time were seen as utterly destructive, and they often were. But, as I said earlier, whatever your particular ancestry, I'm not being exclusive here, we are the Anglo-Saxon invasions. We are a product of the Anglo-Saxon invasions, even though those people settled here at the time would have seen it as a destructive incursion. In the same way, we are a product of the Viking invasions, and the Anglo-Saxons regarded this as the prelude to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and with very good reason when you consider what the Vikings did in places like Lindisfarne. And at the same time, we are also the Norman invasions. You cannot untangle all of these things that happened. But by about 800, and let's take the barbarian period as ending around 800, by about 800 you have a viable English nation. Not our English nation by any means. There were many things that still had to happen, many other peoples which still had to arrive, but you do have the beginnings of England. And so far as you regard England as not an entirely worthless creation, then it is valid to say that in this part of the Roman Empire, the barbarian invasions have had a positive outcome. There we are. Whereas, although it is possible to take a very sympathetic view of what the Ostrogoths did in Italy, and even of what the Vandals did in Africa, it didn't take root. It ended, or it was ended. And we don't know what might have happened. So that's England. And next week, let's look at the Lombards. And the Lombards were also a success. They also are part of Italy. Yes, the Italian nation is Rome, but it's also the Lombards. So was that all right?